To the casual observer, there is not much to distinguish this town from other average Midwestern communities. There is that self-evident pride which can be seen but not easily put into words. After all, a hometown carries with it a uniqueness of place in geography, of course, but also in the minds of all of its citizens. But this town is different from all others. During the past 2 centuries, the residents here have helped to shape American government, in peacetime and in war. They have helped to define our nation's culture, from the Sunday comics to the Star-Spangled Banner. In business, politics, and the arts, the cumulative influence upon the United States of the one-time citizens of Lancaster, Ohio, is unparalleled for a town its size. As the 18th century draws to a close, America's first president, George Washington, dies at home 2 years after leaving office. That same year, 1799, while traveling through Egypt, Napoleon's army discovers the Rosetta Stone, and the Holy Roman Empire still dominates Europe. America is beginning to discover itself like never before. Some of the 13 original colonies begin their own form of colonization, pushing into the western wilderness with surveyors and scouts. 14 years after General Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown, ending the American Revolution, the colonial government quells the 4-year-old Indian War in the West. The Battle of Fallen Timbers, and 1 year later, the signing of the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, secures for inward migration most of the region known as the Ohio Country. The world is becoming a new and different place.
A world in which life expectancy is still very short, where one is lucky to reach 45 or 50 years of age, except interestingly enough, in America. Life expectancy in New England, in colonial New England, pre-Revolutionary War New England, averaged up to 72 years of age. America seemed to be the blessed land, healthier climate, something to be said for cold weather, especially in the north. Dispersed settlement. America itself in 1800 is a nation of no more than 4 or 5 million people, largely living within 50 miles of the Atlantic seaboard.
Territorial Governor Arthur St. Clair petitions Congress to sanction a transportation route into this new region north and west of the colonies. On May 17, 1796, Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, then the nation's capital, authorizes Revolutionary War veteran Army Colonel Ebenezer Zane to open a road from Wheeling, Virginia to a point on the Ohio River opposite Limestone, Kentucky. The conditions of Zane's employment are simple. He is to stand his own cost of the trailblazing adventure and not interfere with any existing governmental surveys. In exchange, Zane may cordon off by survey 640 acres of land each at his crossings of the Muskingum, the Hockhocking, and the Scioto Rivers. With this contract, Zane, his brothers and sons, set in motion a mechanism which, for the first time, gives birth to a truly American culture. This is Zane's Trace today. This early braid of the trace has been preserved and cared for by its owners, Dixie and Howard Smith, descendants of one of the first families to travel the newly blazed trail. Richard D. Zane is the great-great-great-grandson of Ebenezer.
The brothers and Ebenezer were just wanderers. They just had to discover things.
Through family records, Barbara Rolls has been able to identify her fourth great-grandfather as Emanuel Ruffner, who travels from the mountains of Virginia to Fairfield County in 1803, bringing 10 of his 11 children here by 1805 in this covered wagon.
When the Ruffners arrived in Fairfield County, they used the wagon as their home. So the wagon had everything that they owned in it. Once they established themselves in Fairfield County and they raised produce and crops, they would take those crops east to Philadelphia or to Baltimore, Maryland, and then they would come back with perhaps coffee and material for which the women would then make their clothes.
The Zane Trace is some 220 miles in length and is opened in 1797, a year after its beginning.
Well, of course, it wasn't completely unknown. There had been explorers in this area all the way back into the 17th century. In fact, Ohio belonged to France. It was called New France. The French didn't settle here in large numbers, but they were trappers, and so French trappers and French explorers were through this area for a number of years before the descendants of the English came out here. So Zane would have been aware of the river systems. This was not completely dark, unknown, untraced, uncharted forest, and yet it wasn't settled either. So I think we have to be honest about that. Zane knew what he was doing. He knew what lay to the west. If you want to say that Lancaster begins as a kind of a business venture, maybe it's not too romantic, but on the other hand, I think it's very truthful.
I think the real value of Zane's Trace was in developing a truly American identity. Because you have to remember, in 1796, it was still a pretty young republic. And there was still a great deal of debate whether it was going to be a nation of one or independent states within a confederation. Those issues were still unresolved and lingering. And what Zane's Trace did was brought Pennsylvanians and Pennsylvania Dutch, Germans, into the Ohio country. It brought Pennsylvanians down through the Great Valley of the Shenandoah to mix with the Virginian cultures and the Chesapeake cultures, came up through Kentucky. So when Zane's Trace from Maysville, Kentucky, and from Wheeling, West Virginia, came into the interior of the Ohio country, it brought these two streams of culture together. And that's where really an American culture was born.
New England was as different as night and day from the Tidewater South. And it was really only here in Ohio where each of these groups came into much closer contact with each other. Especially along Zane's Trace, and because of Zane's Trace, and because of these folks coming in from the east and north and from the south and east, coming into contact with each other, this is where this sort of, I would argue, a new American culture began to take shape, at least.
The community's first judge, Emanuel Carpenter Sr., a native of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, prevails on the Zanes to name the town New Lancaster. It retains that identity for only a few years, when the new is dropped, but early settlers from eastern Pennsylvania bring with them traditions that help them feel more at home on the Ohio frontier.
There are some interesting influences from Philadelphia, and most people not be aware of that, including the naming of some streets and even the exact order of the streets. When I moved to the Philadelphia area, I was amazed that there's in Philadelphia Chestnut, Walnut, Locust in exactly that order. And indeed that order is repeated in a number of towns throughout southern Pennsylvania. Our town square is also modeled after that in Philadelphia, is laid out by William Penn, interestingly enough, in the 1680s. That is, Penn had the four corner lots of large squares cut off and put together into a central square or a center square.
So, in 1800, both Lancaster and Fairfield County are formed out of the Northwest Territory, nearly 3 years before Ohio enters the Union as the 17th state. And by 1832, Lancaster is the state's 6th largest town.
What's amazing about Lancaster as a frontier town is that it doesn't remain crude for very long. By 1806, 1807, some individuals are building brick houses. By the 1820s, some of Lancaster's fine houses are beginning to go up, including the Moomaw, for example, or the Effinger House, which no longer exists. So that the town grew rather quickly. In 1810, there were about 400 people. In 1815, there were about 800 people. By 1830, just 15 years after that, there are 1,500. And then in 1840, there are going to be about 3,200 people. So it grows rather quickly. Some people prosper and are able to obtain for themselves the same kinds of comforts that would have existed back east at the time. So we shouldn't see this as a crude, raw, open frontier town, a Wild West kind of place, because it was not.
Governor St. Clair gives the county its name for the beauty of its fair fields. From 1807 and for nearly 60 years thereafter, the county courthouse stands in the center of the intersection of Main and Broadway, now Broad Street.
It was Alexander Hamilton that said that the center of a community's being was justice. And that's why the courthouses, in fact, were built in the center of the community. And at that time, of course, the center of this community was at Broad and Main Street and they placed the first courthouse, wasn't the first building built, in fact, for a courthouse. Most of them were in log cabins and sometimes in saloons where they had room where there was a big enough area to hold court. And but it was built, it was one of the first brick, I think it was the second brick building that was built in Fairfield County, or in the city at least, and it was one of the first brick courthouses built in this state. And that's because that's what people thought about justice at that time, as we do and should now.
For 3 years, beginning in 1864, Fairfield County courts are held in the basement of this church on Chestnut Street during the demolition of the first courthouse and the completion of the current building at Main and High. At its inception, Fairfield County is expansive. And by 1803, Ohio is admitted into the Union, containing 17 organized counties within its present-day borders. Though stretching roughly from what is today Hocking County north to include portions of Knox County, Fairfield County is dwarfed by the original Franklin County to the west. Its holdings extend from near Circleville to the shores of Lake Erie.
Happy, prosperous people do not go to the frontier. It's difficult to get a crop in the field. In fact, the early settlers in this part of Ohio, Chillicothe, Zanesville, and Lancaster, typically they would just cut down the tree and they'd leave the stumps and plow around the stumps and allow their pigs and goats to graze to get down the bramble. In order to remove a tree stump from a 200-year-old tree, of course, gigantic, you would have to use a great deal of gunpowder, and there are a lot better uses for gunpowder on the frontier.
The German influence on early Lancaster is strong, as new German immigrants mix with the groups from around Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
But in the 1820s, Lancaster was bilingual. There were signs in both German and English on the shops. The first newspaper, Der Adler, or the Eagle, was published in German, and apparently it was published in English as well as German then after a time.
More than ever, the future of Lancaster hinges on hard work, enterprise, and determination. The access to inexpensive forms of transportation and its importance to commerce cannot be overstated in the history of Lancaster. In 1825, the Ohio and Erie canals begin bond sales to finance the construction of a waterway linking trade between the Great Lakes and New York City. Ohio sees its chance at a fabulous new prosperity and takes it. The canal creates communities like Millersport, Baltimore, and Carroll. But the plan for the Ohio Canal does not include Lancaster.
Lancastrians were horrified, by the way, to realize that the canal, the main line of the canal, the Ohio and the Erie, was going to go 4 miles north in Carroll.
But Lancaster businessmen are determined not to let progress and all the wealth it can bring pass them by. So the Lancaster Lateral Canal is built, bridging the 4 miles to Carroll, due in great part to the energies of Samuel F. McCracken.
Samuel F. McCracken's an interesting individual. He's a multifaceted business person. He had a dry goods store here in Lancaster. There was a branch store in Newark. He had an insurance agency at one point. And he was also a canal bond fund commissioner. He went all over the United States and apparently also went to England to sell canal bonds, and they received a commission for all the bonds that they sold, and that was really the source of his fortune, although he had dabbled in a number of other things and had been a successful businessman before.
The canal, which opens July 4th, 1834, serves to connect Lancaster to New York City in the east and New Orleans to the south and west. The waterway helps to sell Fairfield County grain to communities on the Atlantic seaboard and brings French wines and exotic fabrics to Lancaster in quantities never seen before. From 1830 to 1840, Lancaster's population more than doubles.
From about a little over 1,500 to about 3,200 just in a 10-year period of time. So it increases by 114%. And there's no other decade in the last 200 years when Lancaster grew as much as it did during that period.
The canal era also brings bad times, from an increase in crime to Asiatic cholera.
It starts in India, it travels aboard British ships to the British Isles and then across the Atlantic Ocean to New York and Philadelphia and Boston, and then it followed the canal system into the interior. It's a waterborne disease. In fact, there was such a concern about cholera in 1849 that the health board here ordered canal boats not to stop if they had infected passengers on board or any people who had died of cholera on board. And I think there are about a dozen people or so who are diagnosed with cholera here in Fairfield County.
Lancaster officially becomes a city in 1851, the same year the Fairfield County Fair is held for the first time in an open field north of town. Bringing a sense of justice to the frontier falls to young lawyers and judges who travel the Ohio country, hearing cases and using the rule of law to make decisions. The law and the men who practice it bring a civility to the territory. This security brings more families and businesses to the town of Lancaster. One by one, the lawyers of early Fairfield County built a reputation of distinction throughout the state. Volume 1 of Ohio Jurisprudence, the first published legal encyclopedia of Ohio law, refers to the 1800s as a period of genuine brilliance of the bar of Ohio, concluding, by common consent, the Fairfield County bar of this period was the most eminent array of lawyers ever gathered in one Ohio community.
If you wanted to be a lawyer west of the Alleghenies, you had to come to Lancaster, Ohio. And the question is why? And why is because the great lawyers of the frontier were here and lived in residence of Fairfield County.
Beginning in 1801, with the arrival of Virginia attorney Philemon Beecher, the practice of law takes on great importance.
Philemon Beecher was referred to as the dean of the lawyers because he was the one who asked Thomas Ewing to come to Lancaster. Thomas Ewing read law under Philemon Beecher.
Thomas Ewing is one of the first graduates of Ohio University. He serves as a U.S. Senator from Ohio and later is President Harrison's Secretary of the Treasury and the nation's first Secretary of the Interior under President Zachary Taylor. Ewing's son, Thomas Jr., becomes Chief Justice of the Kansas Supreme Court and later serves as defense counsel to Dr. Samuel Mudd and 2 others accused of conspiracy in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. A law partner of Thomas Ewing Sr. is Henry Stanberry. Stanberry is appointed Ohio's first Attorney General and later becomes U.S. Attorney General. he resigns his cabinet post to act successfully as chief counsel at the impeachment trial of President Andrew Johnson. Charles Sherman is an Ohio Supreme Court justice and father to William Tecumseh and John Sherman, both of whom practice law. William follows a military path, while his younger brother John makes his mark in politics and the law. Sherman serves 3 consecutive terms in Congress and 30 years as U.S. Senator from Ohio, a career which also includes being Secretary of the Treasury under President Hayes and Secretary of State under President McKinley.
He was really considered the chief creator of fiscal policy for the United States and was very influential in helping the country survive or get its fiscal ship back in order after the Civil War. He was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee for a good part of the period after the war, and he became Secretary of Treasury and led the fiscal policies from that point of view.
John Sherman is the frontrunner for the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1888, but loses out when he fails to appease the New York delegation. Sherman is probably best known for the Antitrust Act bearing his name. In 1854, Lancaster attorney William Medill is the first of 2 local men elected governor of Ohio. Medill is the nation's first comptroller of the Treasury under President Buchanan. John Brough, the one-time publisher of the Lancaster Eagle, serves as Ohio governor during the Civil War and dies in office in 1865. Spirits are high, but not all is well with the Union, as battle lines are drawn between free states and slave. Meanwhile, the Southern heritage of the citizens of Lancaster is reflected not only in architecture and culture, but also in politics.
They also bring with them a belief in weak central government, and of course the opposite side of that coin is states' rights. Many of them continue to sympathize with slavery. They can't practice slavery here, but they do believe that slavery should be legal. Most of them are Democrats too. Modern Americans and modern Lancastrians might find this difficult to believe, but the Democratic Party throughout the 19th century and even well into the early 20th century was the states' rights party. They were against strong central government. So people in this area were overwhelmingly Democrats in their political preferences. So this large population from the Upper South affects the politics of Lancaster and Fairfield County, and it's going to have a big impact on the Civil War and the tremendous sympathy here towards the South, or if not directly towards the South, a great animosity against Lincoln for strengthening the hand of the central government and being really sort of a tyrant so far as some people were concerned.
Civil War breaks out in 1861, and Fairfield County eventually raises 3,000 men for the Union cause. Among them is Jacob Parrott, who at age 17 receives the war-torn nation's highest tribute for valor and becomes the first recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. The Fairfield County teenager participates in the ill-fated Great Locomotive Chase of 1862. The North-South conflict will immortalize one local citizen above all others. In 1820, a 6th child is born to Charles and Mary Sherman in this house. His name is Tecumseh Sherman. 9 years later, the elder Sherman, one of 4 Ohio Supreme Court justices, dies, and Cump, as he is called by friends and relatives, is taken in and raised by neighbors, the Thomas Ewing family, just up Main Hill.
Cump was, as I understand, was first baptized by the Ewings, who were a Catholic family. The priest said, "I will not, baptize this young man with a heathen's name." So they named him William Tecumseh Sherman.
The young redhead always appreciates the kindness of the Ewings, but always feels ambivalent toward them.
Sherman goes to West Point and has not a particularly successful career in the military, but the war comes along, and as in the case of so many individuals, it really rescues him. And of course, makes him a very famous man, one of the most famous men in the United States.
Lancaster becomes a hotbed of political rhetoric. And once again, the community's proud bloodlines to the Upper South come to the fore.
Lancaster's very proud to claim, William Tecumseh Sherman as a native son, the man who marched through Georgia, who brought the Confederate rebels to their knees. But at the same time that Sherman is defeating the South, Congressman Clement Vallandigham is waging a very serious race for the governorship of Ohio, in exile in Canada, by the way. Lincoln had kicked him out, and Vallandigham carries Fairfield County. Lancaster's state representative, Edson Olds, a local doctor, is what was called a Copperhead, a pro-South, pro-Confederate, anti-war, anti-Lincoln Democrat. And so Lancaster is really the borderlands between kind of like Unionists, like the Ewings, who would say slavery's bad, but we're not going to abolish it, just keep it out of Ohio. That's about the most radical position on slavery you're going to get in this part of Ohio. Versus let's leave the Union, wage a war, states' rights, and of course then there's the Western Reserve of Ohio, radical Republicans who actually, when Sherman arrived in Savannah, made a point of coming down to visit him to call him a traitor and being too lenient with Georgia.
I think a lot of people in this area would be surprised to know that Lincoln was trounced in the election of 1860 in Lancaster and Fairfield County. He was beaten very badly. He was also beaten very badly in 1864, and that was even a more crucial election. The Democrat George McClellan beat Lincoln very badly here.
The Democrat Party remains dominant in Fairfield County for another 6 decades. Again, Lancaster finds itself between two extremes. The sympathies of the North and the South come together in the streets of the town. A direct result, some historians believe, of the original migration patterns of Zane's trace. These differences of opinion, in many cases, are embodied in the philosophies of the two local newspapers.
The Eagle was a Jeffersonian Republican newspaper and then a Democratic newspaper, and it remained that until the merger of the Eagle and the Gazette in 1936. But the supporters of John Quincy Adams founded the Lancaster Gazette in 1826. Newspapers at that time, by the way, did not depend mainly on advertising, although they did have advertising. They did not depend mainly on advertising for the revenues, but they were supported by political parties.
Both Sherman and Olds have local streets named in their honor, but today the general's memory is held in much higher esteem. John Shuttleworth is the general's great-great-nephew.
I hope they thought more positively of him than negatively. There are some people who are totally against war, and I don't blame them. I don't like war. As the general said, war is hell. And there were some people who would condemn General Sherman, many people, for what he did. But I think when you look at what he did and look at the reason behind what he did, I guess he had to do it. I mean, he didn't have to do it, but I sort of think he did the right thing.
General Sherman is memorialized from one coast to the other. One of the more glorious monuments to him stands at the Fifth Avenue entrance to Central Park in New York City. This sculpture by Augustus St. Gaudens was dedicated in 1903. The fact that it takes this community 135 years after the end of the Civil War to erect a permanent monument to its world-renowned native son gives some indication of the powerful southern influence of the native population of Lancaster. As the nation buries its 16th president and attempts to put a savage war behind them, Victorian Lancaster moves forward. In 1864, 10 years after the first train pulls into town, more rail lines are begun. The speed and power of this new form of transportation spells doom for the once superior canal system. In the 1880s, Lancaster begins a growth spurt brought on in part by the establishment of the city's waterworks and gas department.
The first would be a municipal water works, which is established in 1877. They seem to have pumped water out of the canal, the partly abandoned canal bed, and then they had a standpipe or a water tower on the southeast corner of High and Chestnut near the firehouse. 4 years later, though, they began drilling wells in that area between now what we call Memorial Drive, but that was the canal bed, and the Hocking River. There's a large underground aquifer there. They started filtering the water at that point, so that from 1881 on we have a supply of pure and safe drinking water and also a supply of water for industry. Then in 1887, just 6 years after the wells are drilled there in that aquifer, gas is discovered, and the following year in 1888 a municipal gas company is put together. And the city offers free gas to any industries which would come into town.
Foundries, shoe factories, and a brewery all respond to the free gas promotion. Years later, glass manufacturing is drawn to the flame provided by an abundance of natural gas. This is also a time of great religious revival. The nationally known Lancaster Methodist Campground will host speakers such as William Jennings Bryan and Billy Sunday. Victorian Lancaster is about community improvements, a show of culture, wealth, and sophistication. It manifests itself in construction and beautification. The Lancaster Opera House is built in 1883, where audiences are thrilled by the stirring sounds of John Philip Sousa, and the Martin Hotel is built next to the Opera House that same year. Churches are constructed, reflecting Gothic revival styles. Two examples are St. Peter's Lutheran and St. Mary's Catholic churches. A magnificent new City Hall is completed in the spring of 1898. This new seat of local government is built of native sandstone and situated across Broad Street from one of the city's most refreshing symbols, the fountain.
In the late 1880s, I think about 1887, 1888 or so, Andy Bauman, who had a bakery and an ice cream parlor on Main Street, went to New York, brought back a small fountain, which he had in his ice cream parlor. People admired it and decided it would be nice to have a fountain on the square. The idea was renewed. A group of women got together and formed themselves into the fountain committee. They raised the requisite money, and they asked Andy Bauman if he would make the arrangements and go to New York, purchase the fountain.
The fountain is dedicated in July of 1890. It's during this time that one of Lancaster's native sons is making a name for himself off in the big city. Richard Felton Outcalt is born in January of 1863 at 120 West Allen Street in Lancaster. It is while a technical illustrator for the Edison Laboratories that he submits his cartoons to various publications in New York City. Printing technology has been advancing in recent years, and there is increasing experimentation with color. Outcalt lands a job at Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and captures the imagination of the teeming city's population with cartoons of tenement life on New York's Lower East Side. The Yellow Kid is born on the pages of the New York World in September 1894, and Outcalt becomes known as the father of the American comic strip.
What he did was tap into this printing revolution, a society where literacy was increasing, a place where earning power was increasing and people had disposable income to buy newspapers. I mean, he was sort of the right person in the right place at the right time with the right product. I think it's certainly right to say he was one of the founding fathers and probably was the first among equals of those founding fathers. So yeah, Outcalt was way up there in the leadership of establishing what we would recognize today as the comic strip.
Later, William Randolph Hearst lures the cartoonist to his New York journal. Pulitzer then hires another artist to draw the Yellow Kid. It is Hearst against Pulitzer in a high-stakes effort to win more readers. This very public tug-of-war plays out in court and gives rise to the term Yellow Kid journalism, later abbreviated to just yellow journalism. The Lancaster native also creates the popular character, Buster Brown.
Outcalt's greatest influence was on marketing and understanding that comic strip characters can be translated into other commercial products that will make many people lots of money. And he was the first to understand that and to really do it in a very successful way. In terms of marketing prowess, you know, he did remarkably well, and I don't think he was equaled or surpassed until Charles Schultz came along 50, 60 years later.
He came to Lancaster. He did head the decorating department at Ohio Flint Glass. He obviously knew the glass industry, was a very clever man, and was a very resourceful man. He was able to borrow, I think, $25,000 from a man named Good in Pittsburgh, whom he had known, and he was able to raise the rest of the money, I guess the other $8,000 or so, from various individuals in the United States. And then he put together a very good team of lieutenants who were extraordinarily capable.
Isaac J. Collins is a very private person, but no man affects the public at large in this town more than he.
They brought us members of the school board, city council, chamber of commerce board, hospital board. These were leaders of the community, and they, as long as I can remember, the anchor people were at the forefront of the things that were going on in Lancaster. They brought so much talent to town.
On March 6th and 7th of 1924, the Hocking Glass Works goes up in flames. The plant, known as the Black Cat, is a scene of total destruction. Lancaster firefighters are assisted by fire companies from as far away as Columbus to battle the inferno. I.J. Collins is resolute in his plans to rebuild after much encouragement from residents who begin raising funds for the effort. A new plant with the latest equipment is constructed on the site of the burned-out factory. In 1934, 10 years after the fire, Hocking Glass purchases the Lancaster Gazette. The Gazette and the Eagle merge in 1936. The following year, Hocking Glass merges with Anchor Cap and Closure, and Lancaster becomes the headquarters of one of America's industrial giants.
Yes, Anchor Hocking had a lot of power in this community. They were the largest employer, and they controlled the only newspaper in town, at least after 1936.
So the welfare of the community becomes increasingly tied to the fortunes of one company.
They sold a line of relatively inexpensive glass tableware. They sold drinking glasses. They sold later on glass jars and so forth for pickles and other kinds of foods that would be preserved in that way. Anchor Hocking did not pay high wages. I think even as late as 1947, they were paying on the average of about $40 a week, $39, $40 a week for factory work, which was well below, not well below, but certainly was below national averages for that kind of work, but it was steady work. It was work that people could depend upon, and therefore banks would lend them money to buy homes.
Labor unrest deeply affects Lancaster in 1934.
Yes, because of the Depression, Godman Shoe found itself in difficulty. They weren't having the sales that they had before, and they began to cut back on wages. They had given a combination of hourly wages and piecework. They did away with the hourly rate and went just to piecework, and this angered a number of the employees, and they unionized.
The bitter strike becomes violent, lasting several weeks and resulting in the plant's closure. Wanting to avoid any such disturbance at their factory, Anchor Hocking unionizes fairly quickly and peacefully. Prior to the labor difficulties of the 1930s, the town is known as a center for shoe manufacturing, with 4 Godman footwear plants in Lancaster alone. But now, glass takes its place of premier importance in the lives of the residents of the community.
Another thing that Anchor Hocking did was to hold an annual Labor Day picnic. Actually, the union had a picnic earlier in the 30s, and I think they wanted to co-opt this. They had it down in Miller Park. They had pony rides, they had tents, they had food, they had soda pop. They paid the admissions of anybody into Miller Park Pool who was at the picnic. They had fireworks. They had their own orchestra, they had their own choir, they had bowling leagues, they had a basketball team, they had a softball team, and this was all in an effort to make the employees feel loyal to the company.
In 1934, Lancaster Lens undertakes a job other East Coast glass companies believe is too risky and difficult. Organizers of the 50-year anniversary of the arrival of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor want a special 25-inch glass reflector to illuminate the torch. Lancaster Lens accepts the technical challenge and accomplishes a first. A crew led by immigrant craftsmen creates the hand-blown glass reflector, which gives off a light equivalent to 2,500 times the brightness of a full moon. The instrument remains a beacon of hope to the world for another 50 years. Meanwhile, the possibility of losing the anchor hocking headquarters to New York City is very real. Plans are made to build first-class overnight accommodations.
Jay Collins said he would not locate the headquarters of the newly merged companies, that is of Anchor Cap and Hocking Glass, unless the community put up a new hotel, which they did right next to the headquarters, interestingly enough.
And then they made a commitment to the New York Anchor Cap people that they would cause a hotel to be built in Lancaster to facilitate the movement in and out of customers and of corporate people. So then they began the development and the construction of the Hotel Lancaster.
The Anchor Hocking corporate headquarters stay in Lancaster, and when the hotel opens in 1940, rooms are $3 a night. But the overall economic impact of constructing this one building is immeasurable for this small town. The Depression of the 1930s takes its toll on the nation, but Lancaster fares better than most towns.
The reason for this, of course, was Anchor Hocking and its success and its ability to keep people working, and I suspect that in many ways they did even better in the 30s, because instead of buying fine china, people were resorting to glass tableware, that is, cheaper products. Anchor Hocking had always sold in 5 and 10 cent stores, had not produced top-of-the-line glass, and so this insulated Lancaster in many ways.
A few early Anchor Hocking executives would own shares of the Eagle Gazette until the 1950s. The Eagle Gazette is now owned by Gannett Publishing and is the oldest continuously operating business in Lancaster, and one of the oldest in the state of Ohio. During World War II, the Lancaster home front is, like many other small towns in America, supporting the war effort and hoping for a quick and happy ending. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, a young man from New Jersey brings his enthusiasm for journalism to Lancaster in hopes of beginning a career in politics.
Well, my father, when he was at college, wrote his senior thesis on putting together a chain of newspapers. Others had done it before, and it wasn't just a love of journalism. He also had political ambitions. And so when he graduated from college, he raised some money and came out to Ohio. He had done his studying and figured Ohio was in the center of the country. Ohio had produced more presidents than almost any other state, perhaps the exception of Virginia. So he thought it was the place to go to start a business, and if he had political ambitions, to have a chance to realize those ambitions.
Malcolm Forbes publishes his first Fairfield Times, a free weekly newspaper, on July 31st, 1941. The son of Forbes magazine founder and publisher B.C. Forbes, Malcolm immerses himself in the everyday life of this town of 24,000, hiring local residents to work in the paper's office.
It was just a great job. It was never boring. It was different every day. If he needed money, I had to go out and collect money. And if he needed copy for the paper, I had to write the copy. And he also did job printing.
He said that he had never worked so hard in his life. It was a struggle from day one. He would, for example, get his meals by printing the menu for the local restaurant. He also had a flatbed truck so that he could do some printing of the papers in a town to get the legal advertisements. So he worked hard.
Malcolm is drafted into the armed forces in 1942 and leaves the newspaper business. But Forbes never forgets Lancaster, so much so that the national magazine bearing the family name devotes its 30th anniversary issue in November of 1947 to life in Lancaster, Ohio. From the cover photograph of Main Street to the customized advertising and articles inside, Lancaster is given in-depth exposure to a national readership. Referring to the community he called home just 6 years before, Forbes writes, "This is America."
It left him with very, very pleasant and fond memories. He liked the people. He thought that it was the quintessential America at the time, that it represented town values, that it represented conservative values, personal values, a sense of progress, but also a sense of continuity, a sense of everyone knowing who everyone was, a sense of community, that in the fast-paced growth after World War II, with the rise of suburbs and explosive growth in states such as California, could often get lost. And so that flavor stuck with him, and he always spoke very, very warmly of it.
Just a few months before the Forbes articles appear, 20th Century Fox rolls into Lancaster to film the concluding scenes of a motion picture entitled Green Grass of Wyoming. The movie is the third work of a trilogy based on the popular My Friend Flicka stories by author Mary O'Hara.
Lancastrians were just thrilled by having all these movie stars fly into Lancaster and have all this filming at the fairgrounds. And of course, they encouraged the entire community to come out to fill the grandstands to make it look as if this were a great race. Lancaster received coverage from newspapers all over the state and even beyond.
This is the first time the principal cast of a major motion picture comes to Ohio to film. The movie stars include Lloyd Nolan, Burl Ives, Charles Coburn, and Robert Arthur. And making her third American film is 22-year-old English actress Peggy Cummins. Many of the stars returned to Lancaster for the 1948 world premiere of the film at the Palace Movie Theater downtown. 50 years later, Peggy Cummins will accept an invitation to return once again from her home in England, this time to take part in a world premiere reunion.
A little girl came up and gave me these Buckeyes, and written on the on a piece of paper is, "To Peggy Cummins, Buckeyes to wish her, bring her great luck." I didn't know what Buckeyes were, and to make her, this is her second home, Lancaster in America. Well, I must say I was very carried away by that. So I'm partly here as well as in England. But it was lovely. But generally speaking, the way the warmth of everybody, how they've reacted to one, it is pretty shattering.
In his book, Lancaster, Ohio, 1800 to 2000, Frontier Town to Edge City, David Contasta calls the 15 years between 1945 and 1960 high noon.
I think this was a particularly heady time because many of the earlier aspects of Lancaster lingered. Yes, the automobile had been around for a half century or so at that point, but it really hadn't changed the community that much yet. There's still a walking town in many ways. The downtown is still intact. The downtown is still a center of community pride, community activity, and community identification.
The city reaches a plateau it had never experienced before. The Second World War is over. There is a tremendous feeling of optimism. New neighborhoods are created, welcoming families who have the means to afford new furniture, appliances, and cars. Lancaster schools begin to ready themselves for growth. A local group of physicians and attorneys form a broadcasting corporation, and the community's first radio station goes on the air. Dominating the early part of this era is one man in particular, R. Kenneth Kerr.
Dad came in, and within 2 months, he was able to merge the Eagle and the Gazette and form the Lancaster Eagle Gazette.
The two papers have been at odds philosophically since the Gazette's founding to promote the presidential campaign of John Quincy Adams back in 1824. Now, the Gazette belongs to Anchor Hocking. The Eagle is owned by Charles Sawyer of Cincinnati, a prominent Democrat who will go on to serve as U.S. Ambassador to Belgium and President Truman's Secretary of Commerce. The merged papers put political differences aside. The goal of the newly formed business partnership is to increase advertising and readership. R. Kenneth Kerr becomes a one-man chamber of commerce, using his position as publisher of the newly merged papers to boost community pride.
Well, he was a dynamo. He was a real promoter, and everything that happened in the community for a period, I suppose, from the late 30s until he died. He died in 53. He was either behind directly or pulling the strings and having somebody else out there in front for him. And he built that newspaper.
Kerr is the man behind bringing Hollywood to Lancaster to film portions of Green Grass of Wyoming. And in 1950, the Eagle Gazette undertakes the massive task of publishing a 400-page sesquicentennial edition, the largest paper to date ever published in the state of Ohio.
I think that was one of the highlights of his life, was publishing that paper. They really put a lot into that, and he wanted it to be the biggest paper. My husband Jack was here then, and it was a festive time, but it was a lot of hard work. You can imagine putting a paper that size together. But it was fun. Everybody, the men started to grow beards and get into the swing of it and look into the history of Fairfield County. And of course, we were extremely proud of the paper when it finally came out.
The town's 150-year celebration takes to the streets and involves every aspect of life in Fairfield County. For 1 week, Lancaster focuses on its history and the progress made since Ebenezer Zane's famous trace into the Northwest Territory. A new decade is beginning, and Lancaster is enjoying peace and prosperity with the rest of the country. On May 10th, 1953, the man who more than anyone else has helped the community identify itself as a great place to live dies of a heart attack. Robert Kenneth Kerr is only 54. In its front page editorial, the day after Kerr dies, the Eagle Gazette writes of its late publisher, "He believed with a religious fervor that Lancaster is a fine city, destined to an even finer future." Those words will be turned into deeds years later by a handful of philanthropic residents who give generously to benefit the community. From Anchor Hocking, the Cyrus Fulton family makes contributions to Lancaster High School athletics. The William V. Fisher family makes a new Catholic high school possible. And the former president of Lancaster Glass, the late Dr. Robert K. Fox, creates a foundation to benefit a number of worthwhile community projects, including the expansion of the Family Y bearing his name. This legacy of giving back probably had its origins in 1908, when businessman banker Philip Rising and his wife Carrie purchase and then donate 73 acres of land for a park.
When Mr. Rising wrote the deed, he wrote it with words like, to be used as a free public park forever. And the park boards all over the years have construed that to mean you couldn't sell anything in Rising Park. No ice cream stands, no souvenirs, and I think that's kept a lot of the character of the park.
Rising Park contains one of the most popular vistas in all of Ohio, Mount Pleasant. Called Standing Stone by Native Americans, this 260-foot sandstone outcrop is the most enduring symbol of Lancaster. Its stone face is peered out over tribal villages, covered wagon trails, canal boats, locomotives, and superhighways. It has provided recreation and an authentic connection with the past.
Sometime in the fire, sometime in the fire. Wherever we went, you know you're going to run into discrimination. Now, we had heard certain places to set in theaters, certain places you couldn't go in to eat or go any place at all.
For all the qualities Lancaster has boasted over the past 200 years, cultural diversity is not among them. Some believe, once again, that the community's early Southern influence plays a significant role in the treatment of the local black population. The first African Americans in what we now call Fairfield County arrived in 1799 as freed slaves. In the 1840s, there's the beginning of a small Italian community. In 1907, the first Jewish families make Lancaster their home. Although there is little anti-Semitism, the community remains small. A synagogue is acquired on East Chestnut Street, which eventually becomes a private home. Even as this wilderness community on the Hockhocking is being plotted, Emmanuel Carpenter sets aside land for African Americans to establish a house of worship. Local tinsmith and black community leader, Scipio Africanus Smith, establishes the African Methodist Episcopal Church, now the Allen Chapel on East Walnut Street. The church becomes the heart and soul of the black community and a comfort in times of intolerance.
Every Friday we were allowed to swim at the Miller's Pool. That was the only time we were allowed to swim. And after we were swim, they would close down and then drain the pool and wash it and scrub it, and then overnight they would refill it. So Saturday they would have a fresh pool so that the kids couldn't swim in it. And this was known.
Something else that is known but rarely acknowledged publicly in the black or the white community is the so-called but now defunct screening committee. This reportedly informal group of black citizens would take it upon themselves to decide which newly arrived black families or individuals would be allowed to stay and which would have to go.
It was to keep out the people that weren't going to cause a lot of problems here in Lancaster. Someone coming here that would cause problems or cause a lot of frictions or start a lot of stuff that wasn't allowed, then they would more or less tell them they'd have to leave town, and they would give them a ticket or a bus ticket or whatever to do to keep them moving. It's the truth. But still, it was for the good of Lancaster. It was good for the good of Lancaster now, because you know, if people come in that caused a lot of confusion and trouble and was going to cause some downfall of Lancaster, well, they tell them move on.
Good-paying manufacturing jobs are not available to black citizens, so many become domestics, keeping house, cooking and cleaning, or shining shoes. Lancaster today is a different community than in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Saunders says race relations have improved.
Yes, it has changed. It has changed, and yet still I think it could do better, because we have a lot of kids that if Lancaster would open up their pathways, I think it could get a lot of them to come back, because this still is one of the best locations, I think, for education and things like that. We've done well. We've done well.
A look back at the beginning of the 20th century in Lancaster reveals a time of tremendous change and development. The forerunner of Anchor Hocking, Ohio Flint Glass Company, opens in 1899. The same year, Lancaster citizens are the first in the state to use electric call boxes for the police department. This is a time when most residents have no telephone service. Shortly before the turn of the century, in 1893, the city's first professional fire department is organized, and the Lancaster Board of Trade, now the Chamber of Commerce, is formed in 1897 to help attract new industry. In 1904, the new entertainment of the day, motion pictures, come to town. New homes are built along 5th and Allen Streets. New jobs, like those at Lancaster Lens Company, later known as Lancaster Glass, established in 1911, contributes to an increase in population. The new century brings prosperous times to Lancaster. Family businesses multiply. Mary Peters Bolton grows up in Lancaster, surrounded by family involved in business and civic affairs. She remembers vividly spending time with her grandmother in the family home on Wheeling Street.
And I remember there several times sitting in the dim twilight as it came and seeing the lamplighter come and light the lamp right out her window. So we had gas lights in those days, that would have been 1920, 21, that were lighted by someone, I suppose, employed by the town.
The related families of the Risings and the Peters begin and end the 20th century with enduring gifts to the community. In Rising Park and the Reese Peters Decorative Arts Center of Ohio. In 1900, the Lancaster census is just under 9,000. By 1910, it has grown by 46% to just over 13,000. And in 1930, the beginning of the Great Depression, the town has 18,736 citizens. The growing population results in a drive for better health care. In 1907, a home on Park Street becomes one of the city's first hospitals.
There were a series of private hospitals apparently, and the one that we know about most of all was in the 200 block of Park Street, which was opened in 1907. The house is still there. They would operate on the patients on the ground floor, and the doctors themselves would carry them upstairs into their rooms. If someone had a serious condition, he or she would have to be taken to Columbus. So there was a real concern, and it was the Daughters of the American Revolution here, the DAR, which spearheaded a drive which resulted in the building of a new hospital out on Ewing Street in 1915. But it's a large medical complex today, and that was an important beginning then for this community, which again, I think, like the utilities and other amenities, allowed Lancaster to grow and to prosper and to expand and to be a great deal more than just a small village or a small town.
In the midst of an ongoing economic depression in the late 30s, President Franklin Roosevelt is having a tough time with Congress and opponents of his New Deal agencies. But on Main Street in Lancaster, times are more hopeful.
Lancaster is doing well. Lancaster purchases new General Motors buses and replaces the old trolleys. People were very nostalgic about this. Thousands of people lined the streets for the last roundup of the trolleys and then to welcome the new buses coming into town.
The new gasoline-powered bus system goes out of business in 1969 with little or no fanfare. But the earlier arrival of a more singular form of transportation, the automobile, forever changes life in Lancaster and the world. One of the first motor cars appears on the streets of Lancaster in September of 1904, driven to town from Columbus in just 2 hours' time. But there is not universal acceptance of these noisy and sometimes frighteningly fast vehicles. Pedestrians are being struck and even killed by the motorized carriages.
The city tried to react against it by imposing speed limits. The first speed limit was 8 miles an hour in the downtown and 15 miles an hour in more outlying residential districts, and yet from the very beginning people exceeded it. There were particular complaints about cars careening up North Broad Street at 30 miles an hour on an evening. The city banned cars from the cemeteries at one point, saying that they were a desecration of the dead.
But these four-wheeled contraptions are not going to go away. Many feel horses will no longer be mistreated. Automobiles are viewed as more sanitary than horses, meaning that foul exhaust fumes are preferable to streets covered with manure. And maybe the most overriding reason is convenience. The motor car is ready when you are. You no longer have to hitch or saddle up a horse or wait for a streetcar. But this new mode of transportation utterly transforms life in Lancaster.
One of the things they do is to really undermine what we might call the walking town or the walking city. Even large cities were what you might call walking cities until the early 20th century.
Before the motor car, people walked to work, they walked to shop, they walked to church. This all changes with the automobile.
We're standing at the corner of South Maple and East Walnut Street, and the setup here gives us a clue into the walking city, a really important insight into the walking town or walking city. There's a food market there on the corner, Bay's Market. It's in the middle of a residential neighborhood. People could walk to the market very easily from their homes. Also, on all four of these streets coming together, four of these blocks coming together, the houses have porches. The porches are only a few feet from the street, and so people walking up the sidewalk could wave to friends sitting on the front porch, could go up on the front porch and chat. In fact, I see several people sitting on the front porch right now. They might get up and walk across the market and purchase some kind of refreshment. This was an arrangement that existed all over Lancaster throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century. There are only a few remnants of it now, and this is a good example of what we're talking about when we speak of the walking town or the walking city.
Author David Contasta cites the relocation of the city's two high schools as good examples of how Lancaster makes key choices that favor the automobile over the core neighborhoods.
When a bond issue finally passed, I think in 1959, to put up a new high school, there was the desire actually to continue to have it somewhat in the center of town, and the idea was that it would be placed in the fairgrounds, and the northern part of the fairgrounds used only for parking at fair time, and the fair board refused, and so the school board decided to put the high school out on Route 37 in '63, and then Catholic High School goes out there a little bit further in 1971, and it's beyond most students so far as walking is concerned, and so we have to bus students or they drive their own cars. And so the car culture has forced us to provide parking facilities everywhere for shopping, for housing, for schools, and I think the two high schools are a very good example of the impact of the automobile. Extremely good example, and it shows how far we have moved away from the walking town.
In 1960, as the nation's voters prepare to go to the polls to cast presidential ballots for Republican Richard Nixon or Democrat John Kennedy, Lancastrians are looking to a future that will make ties to the family car even more permanent.
1960 is an extraordinarily important date for Lancaster because in 1960 the double-lane divided highway, which at the time they called the 33 Expressway, is finished. Before that, Route 33 to Columbus was just one lane on either side. It went through a number of little towns and villages. It meandered its way to Columbus. The road is straight and it's more direct. It's not entirely limited access, but people saw it as a marvel. And in that very same year, when this 33 Expressway opens up, Lancaster has its first shopping center, the Plaza Shopping Center on the Route 33 corridor. And in fact, that whole corridor opens up. It becomes a strip for drive-in restaurants and strip malls, and of course then you have the shopping center itself, and then later on in 1987, you have the River Valley Mall in that same corridor. This almost immediately undermines the downtown. The downtown merchants try to react to it by tearing down a number of buildings to create parking lots. It doesn't work, and of course leaves the downtown looking terrible.
In the 1950s, downtown Lancaster is the retail hub. Everything else revolves around it. That is all before 1960, the Plaza Shopping Center and the Route 33 Expressway. People begin driving to the plaza to shop as downtown business drops off.
Well, it was somewhat of a struggle at times because before, Columbus was our biggest competition. Not like years back when, like Saturday nights, Friday nights, why, my gosh, we'd be busy. And, you know, it's just a different sort of business today. We're more specialized than what we used to be.
Local attorney James A. Lantz is Speaker of the Ohio House of Representatives and attends the ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Even with the opening of the new highway, there is the real possibility of obtaining what other Ohio communities were receiving, a bypass of the city.
I had passed in the legislature a $300 million appropriation for highways, and the highway director came to me and said, Jim, is there anything down in Fairfield County you would like to have? So I talked with the city fathers and the county fathers, and they all said, we need a bypass. So I went to the highway director, and he said, okay, you got it.
The $14 million project never materializes because of lack of community support. Today, 41 years later, there is a commitment to divert traffic around the city. The price tag is $140 million. In 1959, Speaker Lons is responsible for introducing and securing passage of a resolution to adopt the state motto, "With God, all things are possible." As Lancaster undergoes dramatic change, so does the United States, by increasing its number of states from 48 to 50. Alaska and Hawaii couldn't be further from this central Ohio town, but they are quite literally linked by design. Bob Heft is a Lancaster High School junior when he decides to compose a 50-star flag for a class project in 1958.
Well, I was active in politics here in town and as a kid, and I realized that the political makeup of Alaska was about 80% registered Democrats. So I theorized, why would a sitting Republican president and Senate want to take in a lopsided Democratic state? So on that basis, I played a hunch. I thought, I bet you they won't have 49 states very long, they'll go to 50. So while the professional flag makers were worried about making the 49-star flag, I come up with a brilliant idea of making a 50-star flag.
The Hawaiian Islands have a registered Republican majority, so Heft submits his design to the teacher, but is dismayed when he receives only a B-.
I said, you've got to be kidding. And he said, look, one thing you need to remember, young man, you are the student, I'm the teacher. And here comes the challenge that changed my life. He said, if you don't like the grade, he said, get it accepted in Washington, then come back and see me, and I might consider changing the grade.
That challenge spurs the 17-year-old student to seek further recognition. 2 years later, after a national competition for the flag's design, the Lancaster High School graduate receives a phone call at work from President Dwight Eisenhower.
He said, I wanted to be the first to tell you I've selected your flag as our nation's newest flag. And I was wanting to know whether you might be able to come to Washington, like on July the 1st, being here for 2 or 3 days for the official adoption on July 4th.
Heft returns to Lancaster after the Washington ceremonies and officially receives a grade change from B- to an A. Bob Heft's 50-star design is second only to the 48-star flag as the longest reigning in our nation's history. When Heft takes the call from President Eisenhower, he is in the drafting room at Diamond Power, where he is employed. Diamond arrives in town in 1950 during a time of industrial growth in Lancaster. A few years earlier, Lancaster Electroplating begins operations with Anchor Hocking as a major customer. In 1964, Lancaster is competing with several other cities as the site of a General Mills cereal plant. Clarence Miller is mayor and is involved in negotiations to locate the operation here.
I got the call that everything is going good if General Mills had a commitment for water and sewer.
Wanting to seize the opportunity to provide new jobs and open up land for additional industrial development, Miller gives his personal assurance for water and sewer.
I had no right to do it. That was City Council's responsibility. But I went to City Council right away, and we held a special meeting and told them the expense it would take and what we were going to have and how many jobs it would amount to if we could attract this industry. They went along with it, but for about 72 hours I had my neck stuck out about that far because it made a commitment that I had no right to make.
In 1979, Ralston Purina purchases the Lancaster facility from General Mills. The world economy and pressure from foreign glass manufacturing plays a big role in Lancaster's future when in 1987, the Anchor Hocking Glass Company is sold and downsizing begins. For some 80 years, the giant glass manufacturer is the economic engine that drives the community in good times and in bad. Still a powerhouse and major employer, the company is no longer controlled by local interests.
So we have a difficult time in the 80s. That's the only time that Lancaster approached being a Rust Belt community. In fact, the period from 1980 to 1990 is the only 10-year period in the entire 200-year history of Lancaster when the town lost population. Not much. It went down by about 1.5%, but it's the only 10-year period.
Not only is Anchor Hocking sold in 1987, but the River Valley Mall opens that year. Although the mall faces considerable opposition, it is viewed by some as a key to surviving the glass company's sale and its rippling effects. These two events also signaled the local economy's transition from manufacturing to retail and service. Author David Contasta describes the rise of the River Valley Mall and its adjoining development as an edge city to Lancaster.
The River Valley Mall is a very good example of what Joel Garreau has called the edge city. He's written a book by that same name, and he talks about a number of characteristics of the edge city. First of all, it's on the edge, that is, it's at the edge of a pre-existing city or town. It's far from the old downtown. It's on a site which maybe a generation before, perhaps even 10 or 15 years before, was just farmland and fields. The edge city is also a major source of jobs, and finally, it's seen as one place by the inhabitants of an area.
One of the challenges growing communities now face is the balancing act between the benefits of growth and the threat of losing a town's identity and historic character. In Lancaster, that issue is addressed by a group of preservation-minded women who fight to save the incredibly rich legacy of the town's former citizens.
I thought Lancaster had so much to offer that I really hoped that everything could be preserved. Then when we started, really the reason Heritage was founded was to save the Georgian.
The Fairfield Heritage Association is founded in 1962. 10 years later, the organization saves and restores a magnificent private home on the edge of downtown.
The high school students helped peel off the wallpaper that was hanging in strips anyway. More volunteer labor was wonderful. Many of the workmen gave their time. We would pay for the paint, and they would paint a room.
The Georgian Mansion is now the center of activity for many community events. Lancaster is known for its many fine examples of 19th century architecture in a variety of styles. Federal, Regency imposed on Federal, Greek Revival, Italianate, Second Empire, and Queen Anne style among them.
When people first came here, they tended to replicate the style or the finishing of their building because of where they came from. If they came from New England, they usually would use clapboard or wood siding on their houses, and very simple detailing. If they came from Virginia, they tended to use red brick with white trim, a la Monticello and all those buildings in that area. The other influence on the facing or the veneer of the house was stone, and those people who came from Pennsylvania tended to use stone. And much of that stone, of course, is sandstone, which was quarried on an aptly named road called Quarry Road, and you can still see the cuts where they cut the stone. And you also see it on the foundation walls around Square 13 because many of those houses are on a hill, and to make the transition, they would face the foundation or the street retaining wall with sandstone.
The community's Square 13, an entire city block, is on the National Register of Historic Places. In 1968, Lancaster becomes the home of an Ohio University regional campus. The facility makes an immediate impact on education and the cultural preservation of the community. Ohio University Lancaster creates a center for opportunity and expression, playing a key role in the success of the Lancaster Festival. This two-week celebration of the arts gives the community a national presence and serves as an economic stimulus for a town that increasingly finds its residents receiving paychecks from the Columbus area. A large portion of the population of Lancaster and beyond migrates each weekday morning to jobs in or near the capital city. But for many, Lancaster and Fairfield County remain the community of choice in which to live and raise a family. In 2000, the community celebrates the beginning of a rebirth of downtown. A combination of federal and local dollars go to extensive upgrading of infrastructure and streetscape. Civic leaders believe making Lancaster a town in which you both live and work will help maintain the viability of the community. Lancaster, Ohio, embodies an historic American experience that is unique in all the world.
The Midwestern culture and what it is and what it means is really a distinction that never existed prior to the blazing of Zane's trace. The Midwest didn't exist as a place. And over time it developed a very distinct identity that's locked in the national consciousness, this American, all-American identity that developed at the end of the Appalachians. When the Appalachian Plateau ends on the terminal moraine and the flat areas of the till plains begin, that's where this Midwestern culture takes shape.
Zane's trace becomes the primary conduit of migration, commerce, and a national identity.
So what's significant about Zane's trace for Ohio, and I think for the United States as a whole, is that this was a place, probably the first place where these very different people from the East Coast, these very different cultures, came into close contact with each other. And I would argue that this was a place where several different types of traditions, these Pennsylvania German traditions, these Upland South traditions, merged and melded together.
Lancaster finds itself in the middle, between Zanesville and Chillicothe, between the philosophies and politics of the North and the South. And this in-betweenness becomes the seed of influence for not only Ohio, but America.
I think it's remarkable that a town of the size of Lancaster not only has attracted my father, but has apparently produced a goodly number of unique figures.
Author David Cantasta believes Lancaster today is at a crossroads similar to 1960.
Since the onset of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, there has been a nostalgia for the past, for a pre-industrial age. This is part and parcel of that romanticism, at least in the late Victorian period. There are many who believe we lose something by moving into this more flexible, more diverse, more multifaceted world. And so I think we have to work very hard to try to keep the best of the past and to blend it with the best of what is to come.
And what would Ebenezer Zane say about Lancaster today?
He'd probably talk about the population explosion. I think it's just grown so much back then. Of course, there wasn't any paved roads, all dirt roads and horses. Yeah, I'm sure he would be quite surprised.
The citizens of Lancaster, who became shopkeepers, artists, generals, and lawmakers, bear a striking resemblance to the citizens of today. Only the world has changed, and they help change it. The desire to become better and the ambition to realize dreams is as much a part of Lancaster today as it was 200 years ago. Only the world will change, and we will help change it.